Okay, now we're going to take a look at some smart sheets specifically designed for teaching vocabulary, and we're going to take a look at some examples of how high school teachers have used them when teaching history. And so a couple of thoughts about vocabulary learning. First of all, when students look up a word in the dictionary and then copy the definition and then write a sentence using the word, what the research suggests is that's a fairly ineffective way of learning vocabulary. In other words, many students have figured out that they can copy these dictionary definitions and get it right, but actually do very little thinking about what the term actually means, and the result is they don't really remember the term, the meaning of the term. Then what they often do is try to memorize the definition word for word as it came out of the dictionary, and then regurgitate it for the test, and then quickly forget it. So the problem is that dog just won't hunt when it comes to actually impacting students' vocabulary and having them actually retain the meaning of those words. So there's some key things to keep in mind. One is that the definitions themselves, very often dictionary definitions, are not very student friendly. They often contain words that also need defining, and so students end up memorizing definitions that also have words that they don't know the meaning of, and of course that's a problem. So one of the things that's very important to do is make sure that the definitions are in student-friendly language. And so you want to avoid defining terms that use terms that also need defining. Likewise, a really critical thing has to happen if students are going to remember the vocabulary. And there's just a ton of research that supports this. And the most important thing is they have to elaborate the new terms to remember them. And so elaboration, first of all, means multiple uses of the term in students' own words in applied contexts. And usually they have to use it up to 15 to 20 different times and for the term to stick. And that's a typical learner, not to mention what students who are struggling to learn have to go through to remember vocabulary. So multiple uses of the term used in their own language in applied contexts. Another is that students have to connect the new term to real experiences in some way. So anytime you have activities in your classroom that involve having students actually use the new vocabulary terms in the context of engaging in those activities or experiences, they're much more likely to remember the vocabulary. Likewise, there's some things you can do like having students visualize or draw the meaning of terms or illustrate the terms and so forth. And that is because when you're having to draw what the term looks like, you have to keep thinking about what are the critical elements of the definition and think of ways you can make those show up in your drawing. So that turns out to be a very powerful elaboration technique that students can use to help remember vocabulary. Likewise, it's very important that students make knowledge connections in terms of how this new term reminds them of something they already know. Now on the Make Sense Strategies Toolkit software, there are a bunch of vocabulary tools here. And so each one of these areas represents a link to a page of various visual devices for teaching vocabulary. And so I'm just going to highlight a few of these just to give you a sense of what they are and how they work. And so we're going to start with a very simple one just to kind of lay some foundation down. And so if you click on Word Castles, it'll open up this page. And we're just going to look at a simple one. And if you look at the prompts on this one, you have a term, what's the definition of the term, draw a picture of what it looks like, and then what would be a knowledge connection. So one of the characteristics you're going to see in a lot of these vocabulary smart visuals are various prompts designed to cue the student to think about the term in different ways or in different contexts and so forth. And when the students are doing the definition, make sure that the definition is in student-friendly language that avoids using terms that also need defining. Likewise, if you think about definitions, they're sort of like concepts in that a new term will have the gist of what it means, and then there'll be critical features of the term or critical parts of the definition that's sort of like main idea and details of the term. So for an example, if we look at the term racism, and let's look at this definition. It's a belief that some races are by nature superior to others, and so that's kind of the gist of it. And then some more specific stuff about that is Hitler encouraged racism against the Jews, so he'd be more popular among German Aryans. And so in this case, instead of drawing a picture, the student imported one, and the sign says don't buy from Jews, so that's sort of illustrating racism. I prefer students to draw pictures, but importing pictures is kind of the cutting thing these days, so I can live with that, although having them draw the pictures is probably a little bit better. It slows down the thinking, and they have to think more about what the term means. But anyway, just my preference. Finally, knowledge connection. At the racetrack, the blue car said to the yellow car, I'm greater than you because blue is better and yellow is bad. And so that was their knowledge connection to racism. And of course, another student may have noted something about a personal experience where somebody treated them in a racist manner and so forth. It really doesn't matter. What matters is the student is making some kind of personal knowledge connection to the new term and so forth. Now, let's go back to this definition for a second. A belief that some races are by nature superior to others. It's a little bit awkward, but I can live with that. But let's look at this second part. Hitler encouraged racism against the Jews so he would be more popular among German Aryans. We know, I'm not sure a lot of students are going to know what an Aryan is. And so that's an example of where you're defining a term using another term that also needs defining. So this is a little bit problematic here. Let's look at another one. I'm going to click on semantic tables, and what will open up is something called word castles. And word castles are similar, has some similar prompts. And so for an example, you'll have the new term. What's the definition? Remember, it needs to be in kid-friendly language. What's a knowledge connection? And in this case, what would be a synonym for the word? What would be an antonym, which of course is the opposite? And if there is one, what would be a homonym? And then construct a sentence using the term. So for an example, the Creek Nation, the definition is a nation of Indians living in Alabama and Georgia. Knowledge connection, my old girlfriend named Kim Weatherford was a Creek. A synonym for the Creeks is the Ochese. The opposite, or the antonym, would be the white settlers. Homonym would be Creek, as in one of those little bitty rivers. Sentence, most Creek Indians were forced to move to the Oklahoma Territory by President Jackson. The route was called the Trail of Tears because so many died along the way. That works pretty well. Let's look at William McIntosh. And so in this case, the term is a famous person. And so in this case, they've imported a picture of William McIntosh. Definition, the Georgia Creek chief who led Jackson's army to defeat the Alabama Upper Creeks. Knowledge connection, it reminds me of Benedict Arnold because he was more or less a traitor to his own nation or his own people. Synonym is Tusnungi, not sure I pronounced that right, Hutgi. But basically this is his Indian name as opposed to his English name. An antonym would be William Weatherford, which was somebody else who was a big leader in the Creek Nation as opposed to a traitor. And a homonym is Macintosh, which is a kind of apple. And so a sentence is because he helped Andrew Jackson at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend during the Creek Indian War of 1813 through 14, Macintosh became a brigadier general in the United States Army. So in terms of semantic tables, if you click on that, what will open up is a series of various options. Now obviously some of these are very definitely little kid oriented, and some you can definitely use in high school. Now I'm going to open one of these just to kind of give you a simple example of one of these, and then we'll look at some more sophisticated versions. And so the way this works is you have the topic or term, and so all terms are going to be either a member of a group of other things or a type or a part of something bigger. And then the next set of prompts are key things to remember about it, and so these are elements of the definition. So one of the things we'll teach students to do is to take a definition and break it into its parts, or morphographs, if you will. Okay. Over here is a prompt is why it's important because, and then draw a picture of something about the topic, and then is like, and so this is like a simile or a metaphor. So for an example, this is a simple one. Let's say, to illustrate this, the topic are the Plains Indians. It's a member of this group, Native Americans. Key things to remember about the Plains is that they were nomadic, they moved a lot, they lived in teepees, they were hunter-gatherers, followed buffalo migration. Important because they were the last group of Native Americans that the U.S. attacked, and they imported a picture showing an Indian village with teepees on the plains. And is like, so the Plains Indians were like people that live in RVs. They're always traveling and they never stay in one place for long. Now, if you look at this, now obviously this is kind of a simple term that we're using to illustrate it. Let's look at this word nomadic. And so the question is, am I using a term here to define this that kids may not know? As long as I've got a simple definition next to that, so nomadic, they moved a lot, I can live with that. It's problematic if you just put nomadic, because then students may not know what nomadic means. Now here's a similar one with slight little differences in it. And this one's illustrating the Southwest Indian tribes. And it's different in that now we have an example, and then what would be a non-example, or don't confuse them with, and then is like, and so forth. This one is comparing two terms. And so here we're comparing a kiva with a powwow. So it's essentially doing the same thing, just two side by side. So each one deals with an example and a non-example, and it is like analogy or a simile. Word comparisons. One of the things you can use is just a series of Venn diagrams. And so for an example, in high school you might be comparing the populist movement with progressivism, or Plessy versus Ferguson, or the Hepburn Act versus the Pure Food and Drug Act, so forth. Likewise, you can take those Venns and tweak them a little bit by drawing a line across the middle of them. And so you're comparing two words, like yellow journalism versus propaganda, or the Treaty of Versailles with Wilson's first 14 points, or the Viet Cong with the important North Vietnamese army. And then what we can do is focus on the meaning of each, but also what are the connections that you're making, like personal background connections between the two. And so what are the similarities of meanings and differences, and the similarities and differences and connections that you're making. So again, these are just causing the students to think a little more deeply and in different ways about the various terms. Another tool you can use is something called word connections, and there are a series of these. And again, there are a bunch of these that are really designed for younger children, but there are some that are definitely high school oriented, and I'll share with you a few of those. One is called word relationships. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a couple of terms and then identify a word that both these terms are related to, and then explain the relationship to that term. And so for an example, Isaac and Hagar are both about terms related to the children of Abraham. And then what's an explanation of the relationship? And this one, these are called personal connections. It's very simple. So all of these terms are related to this topic. What's a new word, what's the definition, and what's a personal connection? So if we look at this first one, succession, the definition of southern states declaring independence from the United States, and the personal connection, well, my parents are arguing over child custody and property during their divorce. Well, that's definitely tied in with succession in a different kind of way, I suppose. Dred Scott, Supreme Court decision that angered the North, led to war. Police treat rich kids better than they treat poor kids. Now, when students make a connection like this, and it's not immediately obvious in terms of what connection they're making, I always ask students to explain that connection and tell me how this connects back to the Dred Scott decision. So that's, again, getting the students to elaborate using their own language of what these connections are. Another one that you can use is similar. It's called best guess. And so what we'll do with these is we'll target a set of vocabulary terms, and then we'll have students either meet in pairs or in small groups and discuss these terms in terms of what they think these terms might mean. And so that's their best guess. Then we'll teach the meaning of the terms in the context of the lesson. And then as a way of anchoring the lesson, we'll go back and review these terms and then anchor them with the actual definitions of the terms. Another one you can use, and this is kind of funky looking, I realize, but it's really one of my favorites. This is called real world connections. And so what we're going to do is we're going to think about one of the major concepts that we're teaching, from a real world perspective. And so REAL stands for reveal the key features, evaluate its value to our world, analyze reactions, and list background knowledge, experiences, or connections. So here's an example of how that works. We'll start with a topic like the domino theory, and then we're going to look at, well, what's the gist or the big idea of the domino theory? And so communists taking over small countries one after another, and eventually they all fall to communism. Next, we're going to identify what are the essential features of the domino theory. And so, for an example, the USSR and China influenced North Korea to be communist, and then they influenced Cuba to becoming communist, and then they're aiding North Vietnam and trying to take over South Vietnam, etc. So that's some of the key features associated with the domino theory. Then we're going to do the E step, which evaluates its value to our world. And so there are a couple of prompts we're going to look at here. And one of them is why this idea should be part of today's world, and or why the idea should not be part of today's world. So thinking about the domino theory and whether we would want that applying in today's world or not, then students decide which or both their perceptions of it is. And so for an example, they may say, well, we don't think it should be part of today's world, because history shows that you should never let your guard down. You have to stop tyranny before it spreads. Otherwise, it'll get too powerful to stop. In other words, we have to pay attention to things like the domino theory, according to these kids, okay? Now, another set of kids, and we'll have them work in pairs, may take a totally opposite opinion. Don't really care which opinion they take, just so long as they're thinking about the concept that we're teaching and how that applies in today's world and whether this is something that should or should not be part of it. The next step is analyze reactions. And so one prompt is ways people cause this topic to occur more and or ways people prevent it from occurring. And so for an example, with domino theory, we're going to check on the ways people prevent it. And so for an example, war fatigue. So as war drags on, people lose their enthusiasm for stopping tyranny and switch to protesting the war to try and end it sooner, regardless of long-term consequences. In other words, they stop paying attention and they let their guard down. Now again, it really doesn't matter to me whether they think this is ways people that support domino theory and keep that kind of notion going, or the opposite, just so long as they're thinking about how are we reacting to an idea like that. Finally, list background knowledge related to the topic. For example, after 9/11, there was a very strong support for going to war against Al-Qaeda, but now almost everybody wants to win in the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. So, another tool that you can use is called links mnemonics. Now, links is based on a memory technique called keyword mnemonics, and probably the easiest way to explain it is to show it to you. So if you click on links mnemonics, that will open up to this page, and there are a couple of different sheets that will open up. One are links pictures, and so the way this works, if you look at the bottom, these are the steps to the link. So we're going to list the parts. That's the parts of the definition. Then we're going to identify a reminding word. Now, a reminding word is a word that sounds sort of like the new term in some way. It doesn't have to link in meaning, just has to sound like it in some way. And then we're going to note a linking story, which is a story that uses the reminding word in it that makes me think of the meaning of the new term. Then we're going to create a linking picture, which is a picture that basically links back to the meaning of the new term. And then we're going to self-test to rehearse, to remember. So an example of that is, let's say the word is compromise. And so the essential parts of compromise is an agreement, but each is giving up something. And so that's listing the parts. Then we're going to identify a reminding word. Compromise sounds like promise. Now remember, they don't have to link in meaning. They just have, the reminding word just has to sound sort of like the new term. And so what we're going to do next is note a linking story. And so what we're going to do is use the reminding word in the story, but the story makes me think of the definition. So for an example, to reach an agreement, both promised to give up something. And then we're going to create a linking picture. So for an example, the guy's given up something, this other person has given up something, but they're shaking hands to show that they're reaching an agreement. Go through this one more time. Let's say the term is republic, and that's where government vote for government leaders. Republic sounds sort of like public, so my linking story is Bob tried to get elected to public office, and so my story shows a picture of Bob running for election. But to help me think of government leaders and so forth, there are a bunch of people that he'd be representing behind him, and plus there's a Capitol building. So hopefully you get a sense of how this works. And so these are linking pictures. You can also do linking similes instead of a picture. And so similes are is like. So for an example, let's say the term is manifest destiny, and the essential definition is a belief that it was God's will that the United States expand its borders to the Pacific and beyond. And so we need a word that sounds like manifest destiny. And I hear the word man manifest, okay? And so I need a sentence or a story that uses the word man that makes me think of this. So for an example, it was the man's destiny to own the whole thing. And then the linking simile would be is like. So it's like predestination. It doesn't matter what you want, it's going to happen anyway. Manifest destiny. One more, open door policy. It's where the British controlled China trade, and the United States wanted it to be open to all other countries so that all could benefit from Chinese trade. Sounds like open door. And so the linking story is open the door to your China store and let others trade here too. That's a pretty good story like that. Is like a private club to allow anyone who can pay to use it. So hopefully you kind of get a sense of how these work. And so these are just a few of the vocabulary smart sheets that are on the Make Sense Strategies Toolkit. And hopefully you'll be able to click through and explore some of these and find some that'll work for you.